Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into the complex, man-made causes behind one of the 20th century's most horrifying and most debated catastrophes.
I want you to just look at this number. 7 to 10 million. That's the staggering estimate of innocent people who died during the Great Famine in the Soviet Union between 1932 and 1933. And the epicenter of this tragedy was Ukraine.
In Ukraine, they have a name for it, the Holodomor. And that name tells you everything you need to know. It comes from a Ukrainian phrase that literally translates to kill by starvation. Understanding the name is really the first step to understanding what happened.
So how in the world did this happen? Here's our roadmap. First, we'll establish that this was a man-made famine. Then we'll explore the war on the peasant class and the simultaneous attack on Ukrainian identity. After that, we'll look at the specific policies that sealed the people's fate. And finally, we'll tackle that huge lingering question. Was it genocide?
Okay, first things first, let's be absolutely clear. The Holodomor was not a natural disaster. There was no drought, no plague of locusts. This was engineered.
And you don't have to take my word for it. Decades later, a U.S. commission investigating the famine concluded, and I'm quoting here, it was caused by the seizure of the 1932 crop by Soviet authorities. So this wasn't bad weather. This wasn't a failed harvest. This was a direct result of policy.
So what was that policy? Well, it was part of a much bigger, much more brutal campaign. It was a war on the peasantry, a radical attempt to completely transform Soviet agriculture and society itself.
The main engine driving this was a policy called collectivization. The goal was to basically wipe out private land ownership. They did this by forcing millions of individual peasant families off their land and onto these huge state-controlled farms called kolkhozes.
Now, to make this policy work, the state needed an enemy, a scapegoat, and they found one in a group they branded as kulaks. This term was supposed to mean wealthier peasants, but really, it became a label for anyone who resisted collectivization. They were painted as class enemies, enemies of the people.
And this wasn't some subtle, hidden agenda. I mean, here are the words of Joseph Stalin himself back in 1929. He announced a new official policy, the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. It doesn't get much more direct than that.
And this liquidation was brutally systematic. The Soviet secret police actually divided the kulaks into 3 categories. The first group, those who actively fought back, were either executed or thrown in prison. The second group had all their property taken and were exiled to the most remote parts of the Soviet Union, like Siberia. And the third group, they were just kicked out of their homes and forced into labor camps right in their own districts.
Now, this table really shows you just how targeted this was. Just look at Kyiv and Kharkov. Their grain production was actually lower than other regions, but the government doubled their grain quotas. And what happened? They each suffered over 1 million deaths. Now compare that to Odessa. Their production was higher, but their quota was decreased. The numbers make it pretty clear this wasn't just about feeding the state. This feels a lot more like punishment.
And that leads us right to our next point, because this wasn't just an economic war on peasants. Running in parallel was a full-blown assault on Ukrainian national identity itself.
You see, the Soviet leadership was terrified that a strong, distinct Ukrainian culture could spark a desire for independence. Any expression of that culture was seen as a threat. By 1934, Stalin himself said that Ukrainian nationalism was now the chief danger to the entire Soviet state.
And that declaration unleashed a devastating campaign. The policy of promoting the Ukrainian language was completely reversed. An entire generation of Ukrainian writers, artists, and scientists, a group now called the Executed Renaissance, was arrested, exiled, or killed. The independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church was systematically dismantled. They even went so far as to change the official spelling of Ukrainian words to make the language more like Russian.
And this, right here, is the critical turning point. A food shortage, one that was already caused by grain seizures, was about to be weaponized. This is where we see the specific policies that turned starvation into a tool of mass death.
The regime passed laws that made basic human survival a crime. The most infamous was called the Law of Spikelets. It criminalized gleaning, the ancient practice of picking up leftover grain from the fields after the harvest. For picking up a handful of grain to feed your starving family, you could be executed on the spot or sent to a labor camp for 10 years.
But the cruelty wasn't just aimed at individuals. The regime also used collective punishment.
One of its most brutal tools was the blackboard system. If your village's name went on this board, everyone in it was condemned.
Once a village was blacklisted, it was essentially turned into a concentration camp. All trade was cut off. All food was stripped from the stores. Secret police units set up a total blockade. It was like building invisible walls around the community and just leaving everyone inside to die. It was a death sentence.
And then, to make sure there was absolutely no escape, the regime sealed Ukraine's borders. A new internal passport system was introduced, trapping the starving peasants and stopping them from fleeing to cities to find food. All while this was happening, the Soviets flatly denied there even was a famine, refused any offers of foreign aid, and created a total information blackout to hide the horror from the rest of the world. When you put all of this evidence together, the targeted seizures, the attack on culture, the laws making survival a crime, the blockades, it all leads to the fifth and most difficult question about the Holodomor. Was it genocide?
So, let's tackle this head-on. Was the Holodomor genocide? Well, to answer that, we have to look really closely at the very specific, very legal definition of that powerful word. Okay, so to get this, you need to see the difference between two legal terms. On the one hand, you have crimes against humanity. Think of this as being about scale, a massive, systematic attack on civilians. But genocide, that has a higher bar. It requires proving the specific intent to destroy a group. The key word, the one everything hinges on, is intent.
And this is where the debate gets really complex. The arguments for genocide are powerful. The U.S. Commission in 1988 concluded it was. The man who actually invented the word genocide, Raphael Lemkin, called the Holodomor a classic example. But there are also serious complications. The UN Genocide Convention didn't even exist until 1948, long after the famine. Other international commissions have been divided on the issue, and some historians argue that the main goal was to crush the peasantry as a class, not necessarily to destroy the Ukrainian nation as a whole.
So you might be wondering, why does this one word matter so much, almost a century later? It's because how we choose to define the horrors of the past has a direct impact on how we pursue justice in the present. The debate over the Holodomor isn't just about history. It's a living, breathing question of memory, of national identity, and of what it truly means to hold power accountable.